Welcome to another episode of the CPC Speaks Podcast. We have Andy Dean here from Penn Medicine, Princeton House, also an expert in OCD treatment through exposure therapy in his private practice. I'm going to ask him about that. I think it's a fascinating thing for me to learn about, and I hope you guys find it fascinating as well. So here we are, Andy.
I really appreciate you calling me an expert. Well, I consider the people that I go to for clinical supervision and stuff experts in this, but
I've learned more talking to you than I have anybody else.
well, I appreciate it. Thank you very much.
So
Thank you.
Learned
It means a lot to me.
So let's get right into it. So, exposure therapy for OCD involves facing your fears, which sounds good on paper, but it might be counterintuitive. Somebody's anxious, you're going to make them face their fears. It sounds like it almost can be scary or like horror.
It is scary.
Yeah, super scary. Yeah. How do you reconcile that? Like, how would you explain that? And how does it work, especially with OCD?
So with OCD and with anxiety disorder treatment in general, I think the best place to start is just psychoeducation in regards to how the brain works. And I always tell my clients, like, the scary thing about anxiety disorders is that they feel so scary, right? They feel so terrible when you're in the middle of it.
Yeah.
But the good news is that there's good news and bad news. The good news is that there's really good treatment for it. The bad news is that you have to turn on that part of your brain, the amygdala part, the part that gives you that, what they call like the whoosh of anxiety. You have to turn that on in order to learn how to tolerate it.
Yeah. Oh, that makes sense.
Yeah. Basically what you want to do in anxiety disorder treatment, whether we're talking about exposure response prevention for OCD or like just different kinds of CBT where there's like an exposure element for anxiety disorders, is what tends to happen is, let's say like you have a thought that makes you really scared, right? That would be like OCD. You're going along your day, you feel pretty good, and then whoosh, you get that, oh my God, that thought, and you feel scared. And then you do something in response usually to make that go away.
Yeah, you avoid it.
You avoid it, or you ask somebody for reassurance and then like, feel better.
Yeah.
Right? So this might actually be interesting for you because I always compared this. So that thing that you do to feel better in OCD, that's the compulsion. And I always think of that as like a substance because it's the thing you do in the moment to help you feel better or tolerate negative emotions, right?
Like almost like a temporary relief.
Totally.
Not a long-term answer.
Exactly. Yes, exactly. So like once you do that, you feel the anxiety and then you have the compulsion, anxiety comes down. It's almost like a link in a chain, right? Because it's like your brain learns, okay, there was this scary thing, but I know I can make that better by doing the
Counting to 20 or
whatever it was.
calling my grandmother.
Calling my grandmother, counting to 20, just even asking Ken, like, hey, Ken, I had this really scary thought that I wanted to choke you right now. You don't think I'd ever do that, right?
No, you're click.
No, you'd be like, no, you're a great guy. You'd never do that. And I'd say, but the problem is then our brain is learning that, like, that's the thing that's keeping us safe, right? So what we want to do in anxiety disorder treatment is purposely turn on that part of the brain by going toward the thing that makes us scared and just hanging out in that feeling without compulsing. Because what's ever happened to any anxious feeling you've ever had in your entire life?
Goes away.
Eventually it goes away, right?
Yeah.
But it'll take longer
Yeah.
if you don't do anything about it. And that's really uncomfortable. But the more that you do this, the shorter that period of time is where you're feeling uncomfortable.
Okay.
So
like
good news and bad news. The good news is there's really effective treatment. The bad news or the uncomfortable news that people don't like is that you have to purposely go toward the things that make you anxious. It is scary.
Like, I guess, the example comes to mind, people letting spiders and stuff crawl on top of them, right?
Yeah. Yeah. So like if you were going to do an exposure to that, you might start with like
Looking at spiders.
looking at a spider, looking at pictures of spiders on the internet, right? And then like in exposure response prevention, you make what's called a fear hierarchy. And you start with kind of the smaller things on the bottom, the less scary things. And then like a 10 out of 10 for that example would be like,
Those later.
you have a tarantula crawl you or whatever during the session. But that's basically how it works. It's like you slow
Should have brought a tarantula for the as a prop.
I left the tarantula at all today. But yeah, essentially that's how it works. And you're right. It's scary, and it can be hard to get buy-in from people because you're telling them to do the thing that they've been avoiding for so long.
So that leads to my follow-up question. What's misunderstood? I feel like it's easy for someone to hear that at face value and kind of misunderstand the message. What's something that gets confused every now and then?
Well, I'll tell you what I think the biggest difficulties when it comes to anxiety disorder treatment is people always are saying, how can you make this feeling go away? Right? I'll say like, what brings you here? And they'll say to you, I'm hoping I just want you to take away my anxiety, do something to take it away. And I always say, I don't think you're in the right place because I can't take anxiety away from people. When it comes to anxiety, the more you try to push it away, the more it comes back, right? So like I always tell clients, imagine a bowling ball hanging from like a rope from the ceiling. And if it's like right in front of your face and this is anxiety and you push it away, what's going to happen?
Keeps coming back. And
It's going to knock you right out. That's kind of the analogy to make, because the more you push it, or like a Chinese finger trap, the more you're like resisting the anxiety, like make this thing go away.
The more stuck
The more stuck you get. So it's almost like a balancing act between giving people practical tools to use to help them with, navigating the disorder, tolerating the distress. But then also you want to instill in them that this is mostly about an attitude change.
Well, that was actually my next question. Now you bring up. A lot of people are familiar with CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, very skills-based, tools-based. How do you work that? How does that work in? How was it different than exposure therapy? I think that was kind of a new angle on it for me.
It's a good question. And I think the confusion a lot of times, or oftentimes, comes from the fact that when people say CBT at this point, they're almost not really talking about anything because there's like 50 different therapies under the CBT umbrella,
Right.
The reason why it's important to talk about this is because oftentimes people will have the basic understanding from CBT that you want to challenge negative thoughts, right? So like you have a negative thought, you notice it, you replace it with a positive thought.
Yeah.
The problem with anxiety disorders, or OCD in particular, is that can become compulsive, right? So like I have a negative thought, I want to choke Ken, right?
Yeah.
I don't know why I keep going back to that. Sorry, Ken.
You're obsessed with me murdering me.
That's a real obsession, harm obsessions. That's something people will oftentimes come in with. They'll say like, I keep having,
I don't really want to do it. They just can't stop thinking about it.
Exactly. And then that scares them because that doesn't align with their values, right?
Right. I think everybody has a little of that. Not the
totally. Intrusive thoughts.
Yeah.
The thing you'll always hear people at conferences and stuff say that they did some kind of study on this, and like 99% of people said that they do experience intrusive thoughts from time to time, and the other 1% were lying. It's so natural. But with CBT, it can get in sort of a precarious place with OCD in particular, because that replacing a negative thought with a positive one is that thing that I described before, right? I have a negative thought, my anxiety goes up. Oh, I would never do that because I know that I'm a good person.
Yeah.
And then next thing you know,
you're riding the roller coaster.
You're riding that roller coaster, and maybe you're doing that hundreds of times a day, and then that's compulsive. The other thing too is coping skills. We talk a lot about coping skills in the field, and like, DBT skills and all that. And obviously, I think that those are good things to talk to clients about, and they can be really helpful. But with anxiety disorders, the other kind of pitfall is people will say, oh no, I'm experiencing anxiety. I need to do something about this, right? You hear that attitude when I say that, like, oh my God, anxiety's here. Let me do something, right? Let me go for a run.
Sometimes it's just about riding the wave.
That's it, right? So if we're responding every time we have an anxious thought to our response to it is always good to go do a skill or something,
Right.
because we're like, we want to get this go away. Well, then we're back to the bowling ball analogy where we're trying to push it away.
And I like that you brought up the amygdala and the brain, because OCD in particular is very biological. It
Sure.
actually
There's definitely a biological component. Yeah.
yeah. And they see that the trends with that.
Yes.
So makes sense. Like kind of retraining the brain.
Yeah. And it's not about making the feeling go away so much as oftentimes I'll have clients, and I'm open with them that I have OCD or that I have lived experience with it, right? Um, and I will oftentimes tell them like, I still get caught sometimes. I still get hooked sometimes by a thought. And if we make the goal to never have another anxious thought or to never have another anxious feeling again or never have a panic attack again, then we're losing because OCD or panic or whatever is going to use that against us because we're still kind of viewing this as like a scary thing.
Getting nervous about being nervous.
That's it. Yeah, yeah.
And an example we could kind of applies right now. I used to be deathly afraid of public speaking. This would have made me, call out sick.
This is totally exposure.
Yeah, but I've learned to tolerate that's the anxiety of being in front of a camera or being out of a crowd, and it never completely goes away. You just learn to roll with it, and I remember saying, "Oh, you can't be nervous. You can't be nervous," and making it work.
The other example I like to give too is I find that that's paradoxical effort is what we're talking about, which is this comes up a lot in anxiety disorder treatment. Is like the more effort you put into making the thing go away, the more intense it's going to be, right? Another good example, I think, is sleep. When you have a night where you can't sleep and you're laying there thinking like, I got to go to sleep. I have this thing tomorrow. If I don't go to sleep, there's going to be all these negative consequences tomorrow. And of course, you're not going to fall asleep then. Yeah, it's like the more effort you put into it,
some nights you're just going to get it's going to be a lousy night, and you'll get through the day.
That's it. But it's like learning how to, if emotions are like the weather, basically, they're going to come and they're going to go. And somebody with an anxiety disorder is basically outside during a storm saying, like trying to make the weather go away. And the more you do that, the more energy you're given to the storm.
Right.
And basically what I think good treatment is like learning how to be okay standing in the rain.
To weather the storm, so to speak.
That's it. And the more okay you can be standing in the rain, the quicker the storm will pass.
That makes sense to me. So it's still, it can be daunting, the idea. I can only imagine, and we kind of brought this, how do you get people to trust the process as a clinician? Somebody comes to you and they're a skeptic and you're like, I've tried everything else, but I want to try this exposure therapy, but I don't want to do it. It's, it's too scary for me.
Yeah, there's nothing saying that you have to do exposure. I mean, I think that is a really effective way to treat it. Like you don't start there if the person's saying there's no way I'm going to do that. Like
we're going to say I want to do it. I want to do it, but I'm really afraid.
Similar to what we were talking about before when I was interviewing you. The number one rule for me is always I want them to come back, right? So you start with something small on the scale. So if you think about the fear hierarchy where like, let's say we're talking about the spiders thing, maybe a 1.5 on that scale would just be saying the word spider out loud 100 times. Spider's a low-hanging spider. Yeah. And then, that might spike the anxiety just a little bit. All right, so you start there. You don't start with the tarantula crawling.
Yeah.
10 tarantulas crawling on your body or whatever.
Okay. That makes sense. It's very similar to what we talked about, engaging me.
Totally. Starting with cognitive interventions as opposed to behavioral stuff. So like going out and doing an exposure is very behavioral, right? Like you're doing something, physically doing something most of the time. But the place I like to start with people is just getting them to identify what their content is. So every anxiety disorder has content associated with it, right? So like that's some kind of theme, like we were talking about harm obsessions before. So like people with harm OCD, that's their content. And basically what I want them to start doing is noticing those thoughts when they pop up and putting them in the content bucket and just saying, oh, that's anxious content. Like OCD is trying to score a point against me by getting me to change my behavior because I'm scared of this thought, but I'm not going to do that, right? So it's just like noticing where the anxiety is going and pointing it out to yourself as content. That's more of like a cognitive intervention because what OCD will do, it's very tricky. It will make you believe that these thoughts are important because of the feeling that's associated with it, right? So like, it must mean something because I get this terrible feeling when I have the thought. That's not true, right? Like that's a cognitive disorder.
Right.
But it feels it feels very real at the time. So just starting to reevaluate those thoughts as they pop up as not important or OCD talking as opposed to Ken talking or Andy talking, like that's usually where I like to start.
Yeah, I'm thinking of a good example. Tell me if this fits or not. So you can have a headache, putting on a physical thing, and say, okay, I got a headache. It's going to be a challenging day with this headache, but I might be a little slower. I might be able, but I could still get through the day.
That's it.
Instead of saying, "Oh, my head," and then just making it worse by constantly thinking about how bad your head hurts.
Totally. And I think there's like a convergence here with like therapy you might do for somebody who has chronic pain almost for that reason. Like obviously the exposure piece is a little different. It's not like you're going out and purposely giving yourself pain, but you can either have the one layer of suffering, which is having pain, or you could have two layers of suffering, which is having pain and resisting it. Like saying like, I don't want this pain. Why is it here? Like, so
the pain about the pain. Exactly. I can't believe this is my life.
Right. So there's a lot of crossover.
Yeah.
Okay.
Very good. So if somebody has OCD or they have a family member, how would you guide them going forward? They're hearing this, like, this sounds interesting to me. And how can people support that recovery process?
So a couple of things, like from a family member's perspective, because I know I was grilling you about family members a couple minutes ago. I would look at something, you could just Google this, it's called the family accommodation scale. But basically, so a lot of treatment is going to be the individual with the issue learning to tolerate the stress, right? And I think sometimes we don't talk enough about the family having to do that as well. Because especially, for example, like if you're the parent of a child that's struggling with this, and then the therapist is saying like, okay, you're going to have to get good at watching your kids suffer. That's a tough pill to swallow.
Yeah, it's the natural parent thing to step in.
Of course, I wouldn't want to do it.
Yeah,
I wouldn't want to do it. Or a part of me wouldn't want to do it, right? But there are probably a lot of things that you're doing as a parent or as a friend or a husband or wife that are contributing to sort of this cycle, and you just may not realize it. So like if you Google family accommodation scale for OCD, it'll list like 20 different things that you might be doing.
right. Would this be an example?
Yeah, please.
Like a baby falls and the parent goes, "Oh no," and the kid starts screaming, crying because you set the stage for it.
Yes, kind of.
Okay.
I hear what you're saying. That's like a good example of the overarching theme. Some of the more concrete things that you'll see with OCD is like, are you giving your child reassurance when they're asking you for reassurance? Because then you're adding that.
Right.
Are you buying extra cleaning supplies when you go out because the kid needs to wash their hands 30 times a day? So you're buying extra soap. Are you wearing gloves in the house?
Gotcha.
Because they have a contamination obsession and you don't want them to get anxious. So the OCD is basically running the house.
Yes.
Or
that's a good example. I get
it's someone who's living in the house as well.
for a family.
Would you work
with a family? Would I work with
with family?
Because I would imagine that's if people, family members are now wearing gloves. That's a tough situation.
Yeah. In my practice, I don't really see kids. But yes, I will work with a family. I will talk to husband, wife, parent about what they can do to help their loved one in this recovery, because it's super hard. It is a lot about, tolerating your own distress as a support person who loves this person. You have to watch them be uncomfortable, which is not easy.
So to close it out, is there like if you had a resource, a website, or it's a book or something that?
Oh my God, so many books. Okay. There's a few psychologists I'll just say their names. Sally Winston and Martin Seif. They have any book that they've written on anxiety disorders is a good place to start. They have one called What Every Therapist Needs to Know About Treating Anxiety Disorders. And honestly, if you're not a therapist, that's a great book to read too. I personally love any book written by Reed Wilson, who's another psychologist. There's some great I'll give a shout out to a podcast I really like called Disordered. And it's hosted by two therapists with lived experience with this. And I think they really know what they're doing in terms of how to treat it. Another good podcast is called Your Anxiety Toolkit, hosted by Kim Quinlan, who's like an LMFT in California. She has really good information. So there's a lot of good resources if you know where to look. But I would say, I think it's really important to go to someone who specializes in anxiety treatment if this is something that you're suffering with. Because
Yes, I've experienced that as well.
sometimes I think, and I fell into this trap when I was a newer clinician, everybody can relate to having anxiety to a certain extent. So it kind of seems like something that's like, anybody can kind of treat it. But once you,
OCD is a different.
it's a different animal, or even panic disorder in some ways.
It's more chronic. It's very different.
Yeah. So find specialized treatment would be my number one advice.
It's great that you're providing another option. So, well, thank you for coming.
I appreciate
Pleasure
it.
having you. And thank you all for listening. This is an interesting new way to, not new, but different way to approach anxiety. So we're grateful to hear about it. Thank you so much.